When the squall passed, the silence that returned to the Sonoma Hills was vast, heavy, and bitter cold. Maeve let out a slow, deliberate breath, her knuckles white against the dark, oxidized metal. She stood up slowly, her knees trembling slightly, as she wiped her damp, clay-stained palms against her dark canvas jeans. At 26, she carried the quiet, watchful posture of someone who spent her days in the archival vaults of Boston, meticulously restoring water-damaged manuscripts with fine camel hair brushes and bone folders. But here, standing on her late father's 18-acre homestead, her hands smelled not of old paper and leather bindings, but of wet salt cedar rot and cold coastal mud. Behind the sagging house, perched on a stony slope overlooking the gray expanse of the ocean, sat 75 gnarled lichen-draped apple trees. They were ancient, planted in the late 1940s, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers against the heavy, overcast sky. "You're going to break your neck out here before Thanksgiving, Maeve Kelly?" A gentle, familiar voice called out over the wind. Maeve turned to see Mrs. Evelyn Vance walking up the gravel path, a heavy wool shawl wrapped around her stooped shoulders and a tin pail held tightly in her hand. At 74, Evelyn was a retired elementary school teacher who had lived in the Cove her entire life. She carried herself with the calm, unhurried grace of the old coast, her eyes bright blue behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I was trying to clear the gutter line before the night rain comes in," Maeve said, offering a tight, apologetic smile as she stepped off the unstable porch ledge. Evelyn set the pail down on a dry wooden bench. Inside was a loaf of warm sourdough bread wrapped in a clean dish towel. "Your father Thomas spent 30 years trying to outsmart that northwest wind," Evelyn said, looking up at the graying house with a mix of fondness and sorrow. "He never did win, but he never stopped trying. How are you holding up, dear?" "I'm managing, Evelyn," Maeve replied quietly. But the truth was written in the dark circles under her eyes. Thomas Kelly had passed away 4 months ago after a quiet battle with cancer, leaving Maeve with 3 cardboard boxes of his hand-drawn maps, a mountain of unpaid property taxes, and a stretch of steep, neglected land that every commercial vineyard in Sonoma County was dying to scrape clean. A heavy diesel engine hummed down at the road gate, breaking the quiet of the ridge. A polished silver SUV pulled up the narrow gravel drive, its oversized tires crunching sharply against the wet stone. Julian Mercer stepped out. At 45, the chief executive of Mercer Estates looked every bit the modern California wine magnate, wearing an expensive fleece vest-tailored chinos and leather boots that had never touched real mud. He smiled, a practiced, sleek expression that didn't reach his sharp hazel eyes. "Maeve," Julian said, nodding politely to Evelyn before turning his full attention to the young woman. "I saw the storm coming off the point and thought I'd check in. The south wall on your barn looks like it's leaning another couple of inches." "It stood 30 years, Mr. Mercer," Maeve said, her voice dropping an octave, growing steady and guarded. "It'll stand until spring." Julian leaned his elbow against his SUV's hood, looking past her toward the rows of dark, knotty trees. "The county assessor came by my office yesterday, Maeve. The back taxes on this parcel are due by January 1st. I'm still offering $40,000 an acre for the bench land. You could pay off Thomas's medical debts, head back to your quiet life in Boston, and let my crew clear those dead trees out. We're expanding our Pinot Noir blocks up from the lower valley." "These trees aren't dead," Maeve said, her fingers clenching into fists inside her coat pockets. "They're obsolete," Julian replied smoothly. "Nobody buys small, sorn-out heritage fruit when they can have a 90-point glass of wine. Think about it. The deadline isn't going to move." Before Maeve could answer, the sharp clink-clink shh of iron striking granite echoed from the lower ridge. A tall man stepped out from the swirling fog near the southern boundary line. He carried a heavy iron pry bar over his shoulder and a leather tool belt slung low on his hips. Silas Thorne was 31, lean and broad-shouldered, his dark hair damp with fog. He had spent 4 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before returning to his native Sonoma Hills, where he worked as a dry stone waller. He rarely spoke, but his dark, quiet eyes noticed everything. Silas didn't look at Julian Mercer. He walked straight to the sagging porch, dropped his heavy iron bar into the turf with a thud, and knelt to examine the snapped wood joist. "Need a new cedar post," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "I've got 3 dry heartwood logs at my shop. I'll fix it tomorrow morning." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Silas. "I see you've hired help, Maeve. Just don't throw good money after bad." With a nod that was more of a warning than a goodbye, Julian got back into his vehicle and drove slowly down the drive. Evelyn watched the red taillights vanish into the fog. "He's been wanting this ridge since your grandfather was alive, Maeve." Maeve looked at Silas, who was already measuring the broken timber with a folding wooden ruler, his rough, calloused hands working with quiet reverence. "Why are you here, Silas?" Maeve asked softly. "I didn't call you." Silas stood up, wiping his hands on his canvas trousers. He looked out over the graying orchard where the dark wind was rustling the mossy branches. "Your dad kept my family from losing our lease in 2008, Silas said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "He didn't let the bank take our land. I won't let Mercer take his." As Silas turned back to his measurements, Maeve stepped inside the cold kitchen. On the table sat her father's desk organizer. Tucked beneath an old ledger, her fingers brushed against an unmarked tin box in a sealed envelope stamped with an old county seal. Outside, the fog pressed thicker against the glass, carrying the sharp scent of an approaching frost. By 6 o'clock the following morning, the coastal fog lay thick and milky across the Sonoma Hills, muffling every sound except the steady rhythmic tink-tink thud of Silas Thorne working at the base of the lower orchard. Maeve walked down the slippery grass slope carrying 2 tin mugs of black coffee, her boots sinking slightly into the damp clay. She wore a knitted wool cap pulled low over her ears, and her father's old canvas work coat. Overnight, Silas had replaced the entire foundation support under the front porch, working by the yellow glow of a battery lantern. Now he was kneeling in the cold soil near the southern boundary line, fitting a heavy flat piece of blue-gray schist into a dry stone retaining wall he was rebuilding by hand. "You don't sleep much," Maeve said, handing him a mug. Silas paused, taking the warm mug in his scarred, dirt-stained fingers. "Sleep's overrated when the rain's coming," he said, taking a slow sip. He gestured with his chin toward the low stone wall that ran along the property line. This wall was built in 1890 by Swiss immigrants. If the stone stays tight, the topsoil stays on the hill. If the topsoil stays, the trees drink. Maeve sat down on an overturned wooden crate, watching his steady movements. Unlike the fast-paced digital world of Boston she had left behind, Silas operated on a timescale that felt ancient. Every stone he picked up was turned 3 or 4 times in his palms before being set into place without mortar, held purely by friction, gravity, and balance. "My father left a leather journal in the roll-top desk," Maeve said, pulling a small brass-bound notebook from her coat. "I was reading it last night. He kept mentioning a variety called the winter pearl. He wrote that it was the only apple in California that could survive a black frost without losing its sugar." Silas stopped setting his stone. He looked up at her, his dark eyes solemn. "That's why Mercer wants this ridge, Maeve. It's not just for the wine grapes." "What do you mean?" "Mercer's vineyards down in the valley use heavy sprinkler systems to keep frost off their vines," Silas explained, stepping closer. "It takes millions of gallons of water, but this hill has an underground spring that feeds directly into these old rootstocks. The winter pearl doesn't need irrigation. Its skin is thick, rough, like granite, but inside, the flesh is deep red, sweet as clover honey. Your dad had the last 8 living trees in the entire state." Toby. Little Tobes, Reed, a 12-year-old boy from the neighboring farm, whose father had died at sea 2 years prior, came trotting down the hill path with a scruffy terrier trailing behind him. Toby carried a wooden box filled with small, dormant branches wrapped in damp newspaper. "I found them in the cold cellar like you asked Miss Maeve." Toby piped up, his cheeks bright red from the chill. They were tucked inside the damp sandbox. "Good boy, Tobes," Silas said, laying a large hand on the boy's head. He looked at Maeve. "Those are scion wood cuttings your dad took last winter before he got too sick to walk. If we graft them onto the wild rootstock along the upper fence line today, we can double your bearing trees by next autumn." For 3 days, the 3 of them worked in the orchard. Silas taught Maeve the delicate art of bark grafting, a skill that felt surprisingly similar to her archival manuscript repair. Using a razor-sharp brass knife, Maeve made clean, precise slits in the tough bark of the old trees, slipping the small dormant shoots of the winter pearl into the living cambium layer, then binding them tight with paraffin tape and warm beeswax. As they worked side by side, the quiet between Maeve and Silas grew warm and effortless. She learned that Silas had spent 4 years rebuilding bridges in war zones, a job that had left him with a deep aversion to unnecessary noise. He learned that Maeve's mother had died when she was little, and that her life in Boston had been a lonely defense against feeling vulnerable. On the 3rd afternoon, while cleaning out an old wooden tool chest in the barn, Maeve found a thick manila envelope tucked beneath a stack of rusted pruning saws. Inside was an old land survey dated 1982, accompanied by a handwritten letter signed by Julian Mercer's father. Maeve's hands trembled as she read the yellowed paper. The survey proved that the natural spring feeding the entire lower cove actually originated 30 feet inside the Kelly property line, meaning Mercer Estates had been illegally pumping water from the Kelly aquifer for over 20 years. "He knows," Maeve whispered, showing the paper to Silas as he walked into the barn. "Julian knows if I clear these tax debts and register this spring, his vineyard's water rights get revoked." Silas read the document slowly, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. "That's why he's pushing you, Maeve. He wants you broke and gone before the county tax auction in January." Before Maeve could speak, a sudden piercing frost warning whistle echoed from the distant valley floor. The air temperature was dropping rapidly, plunging 4 degrees in less than 20 minutes. The sky turned a dark, eerie shade of purple-gray. Silas looked out the barn door, his face grim. "Black frost is coming early," he said. "If the sap freezes in those fresh grafts tonight, the winter pearl dies forever." By 8 o'clock that evening, the temperature on the ridge had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit, a brutal, dry cold known along the northern coast as a black frost. Unlike white frost, which coats plants in a protective crust of ice crystals, a black frost carries no moisture. It freezes the internal sap of trees from the inside out, turning living plant tissue into black, brittle glass. Down in the valley, the alarm sirens of Mercer Estates wailed incessantly through the darkness. Millions of dollars worth of automated wind turbines and water sprinklers were roaring on Julian Mercer's 300 acres, but the freezing air was turning his high-tech water spray into heavy icicles that snapped his delicate Pinot Noir vines like matchsticks. Up on the Kelly Ridge, Maeve, Silas, Evelyn, and young Toby fought for the life of the ancient orchard. They didn't have diesel pumps or computer-controlled wind machines. They had only what Thomas Kelly had left behind, 50 rusted iron smudge pots, piles of dry cedar shavings, and the stone walls Silas had built. "Keep the fires low and smoky," Silas shouted over the freezing wind, his breath rising in thick white plumes. He was hauling 30-pound sacks of dry pine shavings on his shoulders, dumping them into the iron pots stationed every 20 feet along the orchard rows. "We don't want a blaze. We need a dense blanket of warm smoke to trap the earth's heat near the ground." Maeve knelt beside the row of newly grafted trees, her fingers stiff and nearly numb inside her leather gloves. Using strips of old burlap and melted beeswax, she wrapped every single graft junction by hand, shielding the delicate cuts from the biting wind. Her face was smeared with dark soot, her muscles aching with an intensity she had never felt in her life. Yet as she looked down the line of smoke-filled rows, she felt no panic. The quiet, paralyzing grief that had weighed on her chest since her father's death was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire. Toby ran between the rows with a kerosene torch lighting the smudge pots. The thick, fragrant smoke of cedar and dried lavender rose into the freezing night, creating a low, hovering ceiling of warm air right above the branches. Around midnight, a dark figure walked up through the smoky haze near the lower fence. It was Julian Mercer. His expensive jacket was soaked with frozen water from his failing vineyard sprinklers, his leather boots caked in ice. He looked frantic, his usual calm composure entirely shattered. "Maeve," Julian called out, coughing as the thick cedar smoke hit his lungs. "My lower blocks are freezing. The sprinklers iced over. God, to pump from your upper spring retention pond right now. I'll pay you $10,000 cash tonight." Maeve stood up straight, holding her brass pruning knife in her gloved hand. Silas stepped out from the smoke beside her, tall, silent, and immovable as the granite stones he laid. "The spring water belongs to this hill, Julian," Maeve said, her voice ringing out clear and resonant through the freezing night air. "If I let you drain the retention pond, my trees won't have enough root moisture to survive the freeze." "They're just old, worthless fruit trees," Julian shouted, gesturing wildly toward the knotty branches. "I'm losing $2 million worth of wine grapes down there." "They aren't worthless," Silas said softly, stepping forward until he stood just inches from Mercer. "These trees were here 50 years before your father bought his first acre. They survived 57, they survived 89, and they're going to survive tonight. Go back to your valley, Julian." Julian glared at them, his face pale with rage and cold, but looking at Silas's resolute frame and Maeve's cold, unyielding eyes, he realized he had no leverage left. He turned on his heel and stumbled back down the dark, icy drive into the freezing valley below. All through the long, agonizing night, the four of them tended the fires. Evelyn kept a steady supply of hot black tea and warm biscuits coming from the kitchen, while Silas and Maeve walked row by row, checking the temperature gauges and adding fresh, damp wood to keep the smoke canopy thick. At 4 in the morning, exhausted beyond measure, Maeve sat down on a stone bench near the center of the orchard, leaning her head against a cedar post. Silas sat beside her, wrapping his heavy wool coat around her shoulders. "You held the line, Maeve," Silas whispered, his arms settling warm and strong around her waist. Maeve leaned her head against his shoulder, smelling the wood smoke, pine resin, and iron on his clothes. She closed her eyes, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of his heart beneath his canvas coat. "We held it together, Silas." When the sun finally crested the Blue Ridge Mountains at 7 in the morning, the valley below was a white frozen wasteland of ruined grapevines and shattered irrigation pipes. But up on the Kelly Ridge, the morning sun broke through the coastal fog, illuminating the orchard in a golden, radiant light. The thick smoke slowly cleared, revealing 75 ancient trees standing proud, their dark buds unfrozen, green and alive. And at the tips of the newly wrapped branches, the sap of the winter pearl was flowing warm, sweet, and unbroken. By late November, the coastal hills of Sonoma County had recovered from the Great Freeze, though the landscape bore the clear scars of that fateful night. Down in the valley, the ruined vines of Mercer Estates sat brown bare and silent, facing years of expensive replanting. But high on the Kelly Ridge, the world had turned into a glorious tapestry of crimson gold and deep forest green. The winter pearl harvest had arrived. The news of Thomas Kelly's surviving orchard had spread through the county like a spring breeze. People who had lost their backyard gardens to the black frost drove up the winding coastal road in pickup trucks, station wagons, and vintage convertibles, eager to see the legendary trees that had stood firm against the cold. Maeve stood near the newly restored barn, wearing a burgundy flannel shirt, her dark hair tied back in a neat braid. Her hands were tanned, strong and nimble, as she weighed wooden bushel baskets of the freshly picked fruit on an old iron platform scale. The apples were extraordinary. Their skins were rough, mottled, and shorn like dark granite, but when sliced open, the flesh inside was a brilliant starburst red, crisp, juicy, and possessing a deep, complex flavor that tasted of wild honey, cinnamon, and cool mountain water. "That's 40 pounds, Mrs. Gable," Maeve said with a bright, warm smile, handing a heavy canvas bag to an elderly woman who had taught music in Bodega Bay for 40 years. "Bless you, Maeve," the old woman said, taking a deep breath of the sweet, fragrant air. "My mother used to bake winter pearl pies for Thanksgiving when I was a girl. I thought the taste was gone forever." Beside the barn, Evelyn Vance had set up a long folding table covered in a red checked tablecloth. She was selling freshly baked apple galettes, hot spice cider, and jars of dark amber apple butter that she and Maeve had simmered in big copper kettles over the kitchen stove. The scent of cinnamon cloves and caramelized sugar filled the crisp afternoon air, drawing a cheerful crowd of local families who gathered around wooden picnic tables, laughing and listening to a local bluegrass fiddle player. Toby ran back and forth between the trees, carrying empty wooden crates and helping customers load their cars, his dog trotting happily at his heels. At 2 in the afternoon, a quiet fell over the driveway as a familiar black SUV pulled up to the fence line. Julian Mercer got out slowly. He wore no expensive fleece today, just a plain dark coat. He looked older, his face lined with stress, but his demeanor was noticeably subdued. He walked up to the weighing table, stopping a few feet away. Silas, who was stacking cedar crates near the door, stepped over, quietly standing at Maeve's side. Julian looked at the wooden baskets overflowing with red, fleshed apples, then up at Maeve. "I came to tell you that the county water board met yesterday," Julian said, his voice low and flat. "Your land survey was validated. The county has re-established the Kelly Spring water rights. Mercer Estates will be paying back usage fees for the last 5 years." Maeve looked at him calmly, holding a fresh-picked apple in her hands. "That money will pay off my father's back taxes in full, Julian." Julian nodded slowly, looking down at his boots. "I know. The tax auction has been canceled. The ridge is yours." He hesitated, swallowing his pride with a visible effort. "My board. We're going to have to replant 40% of our lower acreage with heritage stock that can handle climate swings. If you have any grafted scion wood available in the spring, Maeve, I'd like to buy it from you at whatever price you set." Maeve looked at Silas, whose dark eyes held a quiet, approving warmth. Then she looked back at her family's former rival. The scion wood isn't for sale at any price, Julian, Maeve said, her voice gentle but firm. But if you agree to help fund the local watershed restoration project down in the cove, I'll gift your nursery 20 graft cuttings in April. We share the water on this mountain. It's time we start taking care of it together. Julian stared at her for a long moment, genuinely taken aback by her generosity. A faint, humbled smile touched his lips. He reached out his hand across the table. You're your father's daughter, Maeve. Deal. After Julian drove away, the sun began its slow, golden descent toward the Pacific Ocean, casting long, warm shadows across the terraced orchard rows. The last of the visitors drove down the hill, their trunks loaded with fruit, leaving the farm in a peaceful twilight quiet. Maeve walked down to the lower edge of the orchard where Silas was setting the final capstone rock onto the newly finished retaining wall. He wiped the dirt from his hands and stood up, looking out over the glittering blue waters of the ocean below. The wall will hold for 100 years, Maeve, Silas said softly. Maeve stepped up beside him, wrapping her hand into his rough, dirt-stained fingers. And what about the trees? The trees are rooted in deep stone. Silas smiled, turning to look at her, his dark eyes filled with a quiet, boundless tenderness. They aren't going anywhere, and neither am I. Maeve turned her face toward his, leaning in as he pulled her close. Their kiss tasted of sweet coastal air, autumn apples, and the quiet, unshakable promise of a home rebuilt with love. High above them on the ridge, the dark branches of the ancient orchard stood strong against the rising evening wind, their leaves glowing like living pearls under the winter stars.